So I'm going to actually trim the lid to our jar on the body of the jar, which is a really nice way to make sure that like the shape of the finial and the shape of the lid kind of go really well with the shape of the jar itself. You can sort of see more accurately, this is our drawing we did in the previous video, you can see more accurately what you're going for working from your drawing to your piece if the lid is already on the jar, rather than trying to like imagine what it would look like, right? So I think this is a great thing to do. In order to first attach the jar to the potter's wheel, there's a couple of things you can do. One thing is you can actually attach it by just using keys, which are like roll a coil, stick the jar to the potter's wheel by putting the coils of clay around the base. Okay, so we need to center our jar. The first thing you want to do for centering is use the concentric rings on the wheel head to get as close as you can. So if you set the jar inside the center ring and the base is narrow enough, or inside the next largest ring on the wheel head so that it's evenly spaced all the way around, that's like a pretty easy guide. You can get pretty close that way just by turning and looking to see if the space between the jar and the ring is like similar all the way around. Now if you're working on a bat, that's like more difficult, right? So I'm going to just introduce you to the needle tool method. So we need to figure out how to center this on the wheel head, right? And you can see I've got it intentionally off center. So when the wheel is turning in a circle and the piece is not in the middle of that circle, there's going to be a point where it's closest to like the tool that you hold next to it, right? Like its closest point in its orbit. So we're going to scuff the surface or mark the surface of the jar at that point. So I'm just going to hold my needle tool close enough so it starts to touch as the pot spins. Okay, so this is like, this mark begins here and it ends here. Okay, so this is like the point in the orbit of the pot that is furthest out from the circle. So it means we need to push in the center of this line in order to move it over to get it a little bit closer to center. There, now you can see we're really, really close to being centered. So that's like a good way. You got a little scratch mark in the surface, but you can just wipe that away with a sponge. Okay, so I want to demonstrate two methods for you for attaching the jar to the wheel head, as I was talking about earlier. So the first method you can't use this scratching and centering method with because it requires tap centering, so it's a little bit more advanced. I'm going to show you that first, and I'll be kind of brief about it, and then I'll show you the kind of more standard approach second. So okay, what we're going to do now is just wet the wheel head and wet the bottom of the pot just a little bit, and we're going to run the pot around in a circle. I was very fortunate to study with Linda Sikora at Alfred University, and she taught this method of working, or of centering, and it was like kind of mind-blowing to me at the time, and it is like such a great way to do it if you can kind of get in the habit of doing it and then kind of trusting that it's going to stick. So all you're doing right now is just building up a little bit of a slip layer, and you just continually add a little bit more water until you've got some slip on the bottom of the pot, and then it'll just kind of stick to the wheel head. But the tricky part is getting it to the point where it's sticky and then centering it. There we go. So that'll stick. That's not going anywhere now. So that's like a pretty cool method. You can just like work now, and you can be confident that the jar is stuck. You can sort of like get it in position, give it a little tap. I'm not going to cover tap centering right now if you're not familiar with that. That's sort of a method for another video series. But so anyway, this is well attached now. Okay, that's a more advanced technique. It's pretty cool. This is stuck, and you can trim now as long as you feel it, and it is actually stuck. Okay, so that's like a great, more advanced technique. The next, the more kind of normal method for centering and attaching to the wheel head is done like this. We're going to go back to our in order to release, by the way, you just grip the pot and turn on the wheel and it'll break that seal. So we're going to use the scratching method to center this. And then you will dampen the wheel head, the scratching method that I showed a minute ago. You'll dampen the wheel head and then just take a coil like this in 3 pieces, push firmly down on the pot, and use a nice thick coil, and the coil will hold the pot in place like this. Okay, so there's 2 really good methods for attaching the pot to the wheel head for trimming. So I just want to give you a quick reminder about the shape that we're after here. So you can see we need this to be like a cone shape with a slight dome to it, and then we're going to be removing everything into this narrow area, and then we'll have this sort of inverted V shape, or this V shape for the finial. Okay, so that's like where we're headed. So that means we have to remove everything here and make this circle a smaller diameter. Okay. I'm going to use my triangle-shaped tool here, and I'm just going to start removing material. The wheel has to be going fairly quickly to trim in general, but to trim a really narrow diameter circle, it has to be going even faster, because the surface speed of a small circle versus a large circle is much slower, right? So if this is a really big bowl, the rim would be going really, really much faster at the same speed of wheel than like a little circle in the center would be. So it's important to always apply a little bit of downward pressure here, and it's also always important to bridge. And what I mean by that is put your right elbow down on your leg. If you can touch both elbows down, that's good. Otherwise, bring your left elbow into your body, and then touch your middle finger to the lid and your thumb to the tool. So like you're connected all the way across your body. And I'm just going to work my way up, removing excess material. One thing that you may run into here, I sort of forgot to mention this, you may want to level the top surface of your lid before you begin on the side here. It just depends if it's out of level or not. If you do need to level it, the inclination might be to use a really wide bladed tool to scrape that whole top surface down, and I think that you may not want to do that. You may want to use a very small area of a tool and to level by moving across at a high speed, and that looks like this. So what doing that does is it allows the tool to have kind of a lot more leverage over the pot than the pot would have over the tool if you were like this, right? Like any bump that translated through to this tool, this wide-bladed tool, would be amplified by the width of the blade, right? And they'll set up like a kind of like chattering effect, which is something you really want to avoid. So use a really small part of a trimming tool to level a surface, be it the top of a lid or the bottom of the jar. Okay, so this is not level, but it doesn't have any high spots. It's very easy to go from what I have now to a perfectly level, smooth top because there's no like high and low spots happening, because I moved across this surface and took the high spots off. That's what this does really, really well. So now it's perfectly level, as you can see. Okay, so once that's finished, we're going to continue on here, and I tend to go from the bottom to the top. So I'm holding down here, bridging with the tool, with my thumb against the tool, and my elbows are either down on my legs or tucked in tight to my body. I also like to steer the trimming tool with my first finger right up close to the cutting area. So think of this finial as being like a little cylinder sitting on top of the lid first. So we have the thrown part of the lid and then the part of the lid that will be trimmed away that we need to kind of match. So I'm going to have to remove a little bit more depth here, right, in order to get more towards where we're headed. If this is where we're headed, we need this dome shape to be really consistent here. And right now it kind of comes across and then goes up, and so we need to remove some of that high part. One other thing you may run into, if your lid doesn't fit very tightly and it's spinning on you while you're trimming like this, just add a little tiny bit of water to the rim of the pot or to the gallery of the lid, but not both, and just put the lid back on the pot and just push on it a little bit, and usually it'll just, that little bit of suction that'll happen, like the dry part of the pot will absorb water from the wet part of the pot when they touch, and that little bit of sort of suction that happens will hold the lid in place while you're working. I did that. It works great. Here we go. So this is starting to get to be a pretty nice contour. You can see on our drawing here, we have this line dropping down, and then we've got kind of a little flat rim here. So I'm going to just accentuate that flat rim now. There we go, it's starting to look like something. So we got to get rid of all this extra clay up here now. So I'm going to just start reducing the diameter of this sort of little cylinder that's sitting on the top. One thing that's useful, especially when you're kind of just getting used to this process, is to define the outer diameter of your finial before you start removing too much clay. So this distance here, if you just draw a circle on the top of your pot, then you won't go through it. So I'm going to just do that for demonstration purposes. So now that's my outside of my finial, so I can remove everything that's beyond that point. So I really love a finial that is kind of at an opposing angle to the volume, right? So if this is the volume of the lid, it's a slightly convex form. So the lid I'm going to have moving in the opposite direction, right? Like an opposing angle. So just wanted to mention that. So I'm going to be undercutting now. One thing I want to mention, you can see in my drawing, or in my silhouette cutout here, that the top of the lid is actually a positive shape, or it's a convex shape, rather than being flat or concave, which means going in. So in order for this to be the highest point on the pot, I need to remove some of this outer edge now. So I always get to this point when I'm trimming finials where my normal sort of trimming triangle shaped loop is too big, right? Like the width of it is too thick or the angle is too obtuse. So I need to switch to a finer tool. So I like these little, I think they're Kemper little mini ribbon tools. They work pretty well for this. So I'm going to use one of these now to finish up the finial. So I'm just gradually reducing this diameter here of this little kind of pedestal that the finial rides or rests on. Like that. There we go, that's starting to make sense. So I really enjoy putting a little extra architecture into my lids. So I've got this nice little sort of pedestal for the finial to be elevated by, and I'm just going to do a little ring here that will, the convex part of the lid will be kind of inside a ring now. There we go. That looks good. Okay, last step is I want to make sure that this is one line. It's okay if it's not one line if that's your intention, but I want it to be one clean line just like this is and just like this is. So I'm going to take the broadest bladed tool that I have and work from one side of it to the other. And just try and pull off anything that's in the way visually. Right? If there's like a high spot or a low spot, I'm going to try and even that all out. So the last step, now that this is kind of a nice continuous convex shape, is I'm going to take my damp sponge and run it over the surface, and then I'm going to use a rubber rib to just compress the surface. You can use a sheet metal rib as well. What's important here is that you use a fairly flexible rib, so that it can bend to the contour of the piece rather than changing the contour of the piece. And what this does is it just forces any extra granular material down into the surface, making it really continuous, and it also is great for like helping to avoid prep work before glazing. There we go. Okay, so there's our nice lid and finial. Right, you can see it's evenly thick throughout. And it fits beautifully. Now if you have like, if the lid won't seat all the way, So if you set it on here and it just won't drop all the way, what you can do is turn the lid over like this and just trim away a tiny, tiny little bit of this edge. Another option, if this edge is a little bit thin, like actually on this jar, it's a little tiny bit thin. So I don't think I'd go that route with this pot. I would go this other way. I would take a tiny little bit here, away from the inside of the rim of the pot, and that would just open the diameter up the tiniest little bit, allowing the lid to drop in. So that's how you can adjust. But this one actually came out pretty good, so I don't have to monkey with it too much. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed that. I will be trimming the bottom of the jar, or the foot of the jar, next.